Hello everyone, and welcome back to our reading of Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. Or, my copy says Sasquatch. Anyway, today's chapter, The Real Sasquatch. Let's get started. Real living animal. The recent focus among Sasquatch researchers has been to collect solid evidence to try to prove that the Sasquatch exists as a real living animal, or at least to prove that the subject is worthy of investigation by a body with the resources and cash to mount a serious and far-ranging expedition. Footprint casts, droppings, recordings of calls, photographs of nests, and much more have been collected, and there have been a few videos and photographs of Sasquatch as well. In all this hive of activity and the press coverage that it generates, it is easy to forget that eyewitness accounts still make up the bulk of Sasquatch reports. Although some people believe that a single species of upright walking ape is responsible for all the related reports and evidence, it is also easy to overlook the fact that this theory is still very much unproven. It is nothing more than an idea. Proving it would be a simple matter, though. All that is needed is for somebody to capture a Sasquatch or bring in a body or some bones. That nobody has done this does not prove that the Sasquatch does not exist, only that it is highly elusive. However, the Sasquatch theory is proving to be relatively, though only relatively, easy to sell to the scientific establishment. Back in 1967, when Roger Patterson showed his film of a Sasquatch to a panel of scientists in New York, it was dismissed out of hand. The reasoning of the scientists then could be summarized like this: "We know that no wild ape lives in America, so this film must be a fake." Since then, the mass of evidence that has been produced has caused a number of scientists to change their minds. These days, the reaction is more likely to be, "Sasquatch is an interesting idea, but I would like to see more evidence before I get involved." That is progress. However, not all the evidence that has been collected actually supports this theory. It is by no means certain that there is just one species of unknown ape in North America, nor that there are any apes living wild there at all. The explanation for all the evidence may be more complex, or more simple, than the Sasquatch researchers who support the idea of a single, unrecognized species are willing to accept. The skunk ape. A series of reports from the southeastern area of the United States have attracted much less publicity and interest than those from the northwestern states. They are, however, just as internally consistent and appear to be no less credible. Some researchers treat these reports as if they were part of the same Sasquatch enigma. Others tend to ignore them because they do not fit the pattern for the Sasquatch of the forested mountains of the West. Some, however, see them as evidence of something different from the Sasquatch. Locally, the sightings and evidence are attributed to a creature called the skunk ape, a name given to it because of the terrible smell that is so often reported. Florida is the site of the majority of the reports, so the creature is sometimes called the Florida ape. The earliest report that contains what were to become the traditional features of the skunk ape was made in 1900. The local newspaper in Hannibal, Missouri reported that a strange ape creature had been seen on an island in the Mississippi. It had been captured by a passing circus, which claimed that it was their escaped orangutan. They had not, however, reported a missing animal, and orangutans cannot swim, which makes it something of a puzzle as to how the creature got to the island. A second report comes from 1949. Two fishermen out on Sugar Creek, Indiana, were chased off by a rather aggressive creature that they identified as a gorilla. However, it was not until the 1960s that reports began to be made in any real numbers. Something moving in the trees. In 1966, Mrs. Eula Lewis, who lived near Brooksville, Florida, reported that she had been chased into her house by an ape-like creature with a round head and long arms. In July of the same year, Ralph Chambers spotted what he called a hairy man moving through forests bordering the Anclote River in Florida. He said it had a rancid or putrid odor. On the evening of November 30th, that same year, a lady who preferred to remain anonymous in the newspaper accounts of her experience got a puncture when driving along a rural road near Brooksville, Florida. She got out to change the wheel and was halfway through the process when she saw something moving in the trees. Worried that it might be somebody up to no good, she looked more closely and saw an ape-like figure covered in hair. As it got closer, the figure's eyes seemed to glow a weird greenish color as they reflected the light from her torch. She got back into her car and waited for a passing vehicle that she could flag down. 4 teenagers parked up on a quiet rural road in January 1967 were startled when something big and heavy suddenly landed on top of their car. The thing then bounced down onto the bonnet and peered in before bounding off. They described it as a hairy ape man and reported that it had smelt absolutely awful. In July 1968, near Kinloch, Missouri, a gorilla suddenly appeared in a backyard of a rural house. The creature grabbed hold of a small boy, but dropped him and bounded off when an adult intervened. Charles Robertson was walking through a guava orchard near Davie, Florida in 1969 when he was confronted by a hairy man-monkey thing which growled at him. Robertson prudently backed off. A rather less aggressive skunk ape was that encountered by H. Osborne and a friend when they were camping out in the Big Cypress Swamp area of Florida. At around 3 a.m., Osborne woke up to hear what he took to be some sort of animal snuffling about outside the tent. Thinking that it was a raccoon or something similar after their food, Osborne threw open the tent flap and shouted. He was alarmed to find himself looking at a chimpanzee-type creature that emitted a horrible stench. The animal glanced round at Osborne, then fled into the night. Then, in August 1971, a Broward County rabies control officer named Henry Ring was sent to investigate reports of a wild ape that was causing a nuisance to homeowners in a rural area of the county. He found no apes, but he did notice some strange tracks that looked as if a man had been walking about on his hands and knuckles. These are exactly the sort of tracks that would be left by a large ape. Most apes support their weight on 4 limbs, with the hands of the front limbs curled into a fist and the weight put onto the knuckles. A pair of workmen had a strange experience in May 1973. They were working on some holiday houses in the Everglades near Naples, when on the second day, just as dusk was drawing in, one of the men heard something moving about in the swampy forest nearby. He looked up to see a pair of eyes glowing at him from the undergrowth, about 20 feet away. At first, he thought it was a bear, but when it moved, he saw that the face was more like that of a human. Around it were strands of long, wispy hair. The man was concerned for his safety, so he began to back off. When he felt that it was safe to do so, he ran to a house where the men had some guns. The men watched from the windows as the creature came out of the trees. It walked on its hind legs, but with an odd waddling gait. Then it grabbed some of the food that they had been preparing to cook on a campfire before slipping back into cover. With hindsight, the main witness thought that the closest thing to what he had seen was an orangutan. When the men emerged from the house, they noticed a strong smell that one of them thought was like that of a pigsty that needed a good clean. When they had been working for a couple of hours, one of the men on the ground gave a yell. He had seen a creature climb out of the cellar. His shout brought all the men to his side. They saw the animal walk upright across the open ground to some trees about 40 yards distant. Then it turned to sit down and look at the workmen. The beast was about 5 feet tall and was covered all over in long reddish-colored hair. After several minutes, it stood up again and plunged into the dense forest. The curious workmen then investigated the cellar and found a pile of sacking and rags that appeared to have been the creature's sleeping area. Sightings from cars have been common. For instance, a woman was driving back to her rural home in December 1985 after completing her night shift at work. Motoring along the highway from Tavares, she saw a large animal moving out of the woods. The creature was walking on its hind legs only, but she did not get a very good look at it. She slowed down as she passed the place where it had entered the trees and round down the car window to get a better look. Although she could not see anything, she was hit by a deeply offensive stench. Another road-related sighting came in August 2004, when Jennifer Ward was driving through Polk Country, Florida. It was evening, and her 2 young daughters were asleep in the back of her vehicle. As she passed near Green Swamp, she saw what she took to be a human bending down in a roadside ditch. She slowed down to find out if she could offer any help. As she was about to get out of the car, the figure stood up. Ward was shocked to find herself confronted by a hairy ape-like figure about 8 feet tall. Putting the safety of her daughters ahead of any curiosity, Ward drove off at a speed. Close to Green Cove Spring, Florida in 1986, a mother and her son had a similar experience when they were driving along State Route 209 late one evening. Suddenly, a human-like figure, about 5 feet tall and covered all over in hair, appeared in the headlights. It glanced quickly at the approaching vehicle and then bounded off the road to slip away among the trees. In 1993, some interesting tracks were found in the swamps of Collier County. A hunter was out looking for hogs when he found the tracks of 2 creatures walking in a bipedal fashion. One of the creatures was obviously much larger than the other, which might have been a juvenile. The footprints were shaped like a human hand, but one that was slightly deformed, and the larger creature had a stride of almost 6 feet. Because the tracks were quite unlike any the man had ever seen in Florida before, he referred to a textbook when he got home. He found that the closest match was the hind foot of a gorilla. Another road encounter took place on Turner Road outside Everglades City in 2001. This time the creature was squatting by the side of the road. It was about 3 feet tall when it was in a sitting position. The driver slowed down to get a closer look, but as the car approached, the animal got up onto all fours. Its front legs were much longer than its back legs, and it was covered in brown hair. It then moved off quickly and disappeared into some trees. The driver thought that it looked like a chimpanzee rather than anything else. When these and other reports are added to footprint casts and other evidence, what seems to emerge is that the skunk ape is quite a different creature from the Sasquatch of the Northwest. The Sasquatch is routinely described as being a massive creature, walking upright like a human. In comparison, the skunk ape is usually reported as being much smaller, and either walks on all fours or with a waddling gait if upright. It is generally described as being very like a chimpanzee or an orangutan. The few footprint casts that have been taken would seem to confirm this, because they suggest a foot that is very much like that of an ape. Because the big toe sticks out sideways, perhaps as a tree climbing aid, the creature's footprints look rather like a human hand. Most skunk ape reports come from Florida, but the creature has also been seen in and around swampy forests throughout the hot southern states. This habitat is very different from the mountainous woods of the Northwest, so it would be surprising if the Sasquatch could thrive in both places. Indeed, an orangutan or chimpanzee type creature would be more suited to the hot swamp forests than a Sasquatch. On December 29, 2000, the Sheriff's Office in Sarasota, Florida received a letter addressed to the Animal Services Department. The Sheriff had no such department, so the letter was passed on to the General Inquiry Desk. When it was opened, the envelope contained a long letter and 2 photographs. The letter was from a lady asking if any local zoo or circus had lost an orangutan, since one had been visiting her property recently. The 2 photographs were of the ape, and they had been enclosed in order that the animal might be recognized. The sheriff knew of no exotic animals that had been reported lost, but on January 3rd, he contacted David Barkassi of the nearby Silver City Serpentarium for advice. Barkassi knew all about the skunk ape and wondered if the photographs of an escaped orangutan were actually of the skunk ape. Unfortunately, the letter was anonymous. All the writer said was that she and her husband were retired and were living near the Mayaca State Park. In February, the pictures and some comments from the letter were released to the local press and media in the hope that the writer of the letter could be persuaded to come forward. To date, she has not done so. This, of course, raises the possibility that the Mayaca ape photos, as they have become known, are a hoax, though it may simply be that the retired lady has no wish to get mixed up in the skunk ape controversy. The photographs were sent to Loren Coleman, a noted Bigfoot researcher, who analyzed them himself before sending copies to assorted photographic and primate experts. All came to the conclusion that the photographs had not been produced by a digital tampering or other fraudulent means. The creature that was depicted seems to be very similar to an orangutan. Even its facial expression is similar to that of an orangutan that is showing fear or surprise, which would be natural if its evening foraging were suddenly interrupted by a camera flash. Aberrant behavior. It is not just in the southeast of the United States that the evidence points to something different from the classical Sasquatch. Across much of America, there are reports of Sasquatch-type creatures that behave in remarkably un-Sasquatch ways. Some of the reports from the 1960s hinted at this sort of aberrant behavior, which puzzled researchers. The trend really got going, however, in the 1970s. Among the more famous of these reports was a string of cases from around Fouke in Kentucky. They told of a Bigfoot-type creature that behaved in an aggressive and often terrifying way towards humans. The Ford case was typical. On the night of May 1st, 1971, Mrs. Ford was woken up as her bedroom window was pushed open. Through the open window came a hairy arm, bearing a large, clawed hand that grasped out for her. Behind the window, Mrs. Ford glimpsed an ape-like face. When she screamed, the arm and the face retreated. Mr. Ford grabbed a gun and ran out of the house just in time to see a Sasquatch figure. He fired, but the creature took no notice and slipped off into the trees. An hour later, the beast was back, on this occasion trying to kick the front door down. Ford shot at it again, and this time it left for good. The Falk cases were made into a low-budget horror movie called Legend of Boggy Creek. The film was so successful that it spawned 3 sequels. The Bigfoot in the movie was even more aggressive than the real-life reports from around Falk would suggest. It was also successfully violent, while the aggressive creatures encountered by real people were usually strangely unable to do any real damage, despite their enormous size, great strength, and obvious evil intent. Joan Milnes and Mary Ryan stopped for a picnic near the town of Louisiana, Missouri in July 1971. They had just laid out their meal when a Bigfoot came lumbering out of some nearby bushes. It was making a weird gurgling noise and was behaving in a threatening manner. The 2 women fled for their car and locked themselves in, but they could not drive off because they had left the keys with their picnic. Then, the approaching Bigfoot lumbered up to the car and tried to open the doors. Unable to do so, it turned to the picnic and ate some food before returning to the undergrowth from which it had emerged. Once it was gone, Milnes retrieved the keys and they drove off. In the same month, a Bigfoot went to a farm near Shapsville, Indiana, on 5 separate occasions. Each time, it came at night, and once it attacked the farm dog, though without inflicting any serious injury. The farmer shot at it several times, but never seemed to be able to hit the thing. A couple of years later, in June 1973, 4 teenage girls were in a car sheltering from a thunderstorm when they were approached by an 8-foot-tall Bigfoot that growled and screamed at them. The beast had large eyes that glowed bright red. Although the teenagers drove off at speed, the Bigfoot seemed to be able to move even quicker, because they saw it standing beside the road ahead of them as they sped off. When they reached the home of one of the girls, the Bigfoot was waiting. After glaring at them with its red eyes, it walked off. The UFOs land. Later that year, on October 25th, a 22-year-old farmer's son named Stephen saw a large red glowing ball fall from the sky and land in a field. Stephen took up a shotgun and went to investigate, accompanied by his 10-year-old brother and a visiting friend. As they entered the field, the 3 saw that the red ball was floating a few feet above the ground. Beside the ball were standing 2 large human-like figures with ape-like heads. They were covered with dark hair. When the Bigfoot figures caught sight of the humans, they abandoned the glowing ball and began advancing on the boys. Stephen fired over their heads, but they kept on advancing. He then aimed straight at the lead Bigfoot and blasted it 3 times at close range. The Bigfoot came to a halt and raised its arm, but otherwise showed no sign of having been hit by the shotgun blast. At this point, the red ball rose up and flew off. The creatures watched it, and then turned and walked off into a nearby wood. That same month, Jeff Martin had an encounter which involved both a Bigfoot and a UFO on the outskirts of Galveston, Indiana. He was out fishing when he saw a 9-foot tall, pale-colored Bigfoot about 200 feet away. When it saw him, the Bigfoot fled, but Martin gave chase. The creature ran across a road, left a wide ditch, and disappeared into woodland. Almost instantly, a bronze-colored UFO rose out of the woods and flew off. In February of the following year, another man in Pennsylvania saw a strange red UFO hovering over woods near his home. When he went out onto his porch to get a better look, he saw 4 or more Bigfoot-like creatures moving around the edge of the wood. He grabbed a shotgun, but both the creatures and the UFO disappeared without approaching him. The paranormal. UFOs apart, the Bigfoots being seen in Pennsylvania could behave very strangely. A man was walking his dog in a rural area near Uniontown in November 1973 when he saw a tall, hairy Bigfoot with glowing red eyes standing on the path ahead of him. The area was plagued by wild dogs, so the man had a revolver in his pocket. When the Bigfoot began running towards him, with its arms uplifted in threatening fashion, the man pulled out his gun. As the creature got to within 15 feet of him, he fired, pumping 6 bullets into the thing. The Bigfoot then faded away in front of his eyes. Reports from other states also show the Bigfoot in a sinister light. At Carlisle, Ohio in October 1972, a Bigfoot with glowing orange eyes ran across a field, hissing and snarling at the hapless human who saw it. Outside Duluth, Minnesota, an 8-foot-tall, white furry Bigfoot walked through a building site, stopping to look inside an unfinished house. Then, in August 1976, a Bigfoot was seen near Whitehall, New York State. It had red eyes and was covered in very long hair. Less than a year afterwards, in May 1977, a Bigfoot visited a farm near Wantage in New Jersey. The farmer, Mr. Seitz, grabbed his .22 Magnum rifle and shot it, but without any effect. He then tried a shotgun loaded with deer pellets, but that had no effect either. The Bigfoot just growled in response, then walked off. It is hardly surprising that these odd and very untypical creatures tend to be ignored by Sasquatch investigators. Most of those that do pay attention to the Bigfoot sightings that take place outside the northwest area of North America tend to pay them only cursory attention and try to avoid referring to the ability of these creatures to vanish to thin air, survive being shot at point-blank range, or to hop on board UFOs. The Eastern Bigfoot. A few researchers, however, have suggested that there might be a subspecies or variant of the Sasquatch. This modified creature has usually gone by the name of the Eastern Bigfoot. It is suggested that this Eastern Bigfoot has developed a more aggressive streak and more threatening behavior because it lives in closer proximity to humans. If so, the Eastern Bigfoot would be an unusual creature. The usual reaction of large mammals faced by a growing human population is to move away, or to become more retiring and nocturnal than they are usually. It was Jack Lapsuritis who put forward a radical idea to explain the curious traits and behaviors of the Eastern Bigfoot. He pointed out that the areas in which these encounters took place were rural regions of states with relatively dense human populations. These were areas from which bear, cougar, and wolves had long since been displaced. It was unlikely that Sasquatch populations would continue to live in a place from which other large mammals had fled. He also noted that the actions of some Eastern Bigfoots were not only odd for a wild ape, They were utterly impossible or fantastical. Animals cannot simply vanish into thin air. Lapsuritis suggested that these were not encounters with a real animal at all, but with the paranormal. For this, he came in for a lot of criticism and became unpopular with many Sasquatch researchers. They felt that his ideas were undermining their task of trying to convince mainstream science that the Sasquatch was a real animal species. On June 24, 1989, the Department of Anthropology at Washington State University hosted a Sasquatch symposium in partnership with the International Society of Cryptozoology, in an effort to deliver the broadest possible range of opinion. The organizers invited Lapsuritis to speak. The opening of Lapsuritis' speech was interrupted by a loud protest, which was led by René de Hinden, who objected to his presence. One of Lapsuritis' books had these remarks on the back cover. In 1979, Mr. Lapsuritis was first telepathically contacted by a Sasquatch and ET simultaneously, which was the shock of his life. To further complicate matters, the contact changed him, and he developed psychic ability overnight, which triggered a spiritual transformation. Jack Lapsuritis has since dropped out of the Sasquatch scene, but his ideas have continued to circulate. They are not as far-fetched as some researchers might think. The paranormal is, by its very nature, unexplained. It is open to widely varying interpretations and conclusions, even among those who profess to believe that it has an objective reality. In reference to the Sasquatch, it must be admitted that many of the sightings of the eastern Bigfoot have more in common with the paranormal than with the zoology. The link in UFOs in some sightings is one clue. The ability to ignore being shot is another. There are also more subtle clues to the unworldly nature of the eastern Bigfoot. Supernatural creatures from many parts of the world are said to have eyes that are abnormally large or glow red or both. It is also the case that paranormal animals are very often aggressively hostile to humans, but never manage to inflict any actual harm. In all of these ways, the more bizarre sightings of the eastern Bigfoot are closer to the horrific Black Shuck of England, or the malevolent Vatala of India, than to the Sasquatch. It is also striking that the eastern Bigfoot was not reported until the events at the 1958 construction camp in Bluff Creek catapulted the Bigfoot into the national media. The pace of sightings increased after the 1967 Patterson film was widely shown, and speeded up again after the horror movie Legend of Boggy Creek was released. Encounters with paranormal creatures nearly always fit into a type that is already known to the recipient. That does not necessarily mean that the witness invented the encounter or was hallucinating. Some researchers believe that paranormal entities take a form that the witness expects them to take, by some psychic means. It is clear, however, that those sightings of Bigfoots that behaved in paranormal ways began only after the wider American public became aware of the possible existence of the Bigfoot. The reports of eastern Bigfoots behaving in bizarre ways were made in all good faith, but whether the reports should be classified with the Sasquatch or with UFOs and ghosts is a matter of conjecture. A description of the Sasquatch. Returning to the Sasquatch on the forested slopes of the Pacific Mountains, the evidence is far clearer, much more impressive, and more indicative of a real animal. But even if it is accepted that the Sasquatch is a real creature, it then needs to be categorized in some way. From the physical evidence, sightings, and other material that has been gathered, a tentative description of the Sasquatch and its habits can be produced. Sasquatches are primates that walk on their hind legs and are covered with hair. An adult is around 7 to 8 feet tall and weighs around 650 pounds on average. Also, there is some evidence that males are slightly larger than females. The hair that covers a Sasquatch is generally black to reddish-brown in color, though it may be lighter in places. A comparison with other primates would indicate that it turns paler with advanced age. It tends to be around 3 to 6 inches in length, but there are some reports of manes of longer hair around the head and neck. These manes may be confined to males. The skin, when it can be seen, is generally dark, ranging from black to brown. Heads are generally ape-like, rising to a peak at the back. This suggests the presence of a sagittal crest and enlarged jaw muscles, while the size of the head indicates a brain capacity that is marginally larger than that of a gorilla. Faces are large, with prominent brow ridges, deep-set eyes, and wide cheeks, from which the mouth does not protrude markedly. Noses seem to be halfway between those of apes and humans. Ears are generally small and are usually hidden under the hair. The bodies of these creatures are massive and muscular, being almost as thick front to back as they are side to side. Their shoulders are wider in proportion to their height than is usual for a human, and that width is maintained right down to the equally wide hips. This gives a huge volume for the lungs and the digestive system. Females have visible breasts. Sasquatches have arms that are heavily muscled and long, reaching almost to the knees. Their hands are large and wide with stubby fingers and short thumbs that are not opposable to the fingers, while the legs are also massive and heavily muscled. The feet are wide and they exhibit a mid-tarsal break, the ability to flex halfway along their length. Finally, the toes are long and prehensile, giving the ability to grip uneven or wet ground. The Sasquatch seem to be more active at night, as well as at dusk and dawn, than during the day. It must be assumed, therefore, that their night vision is good compared to that of humans. They also have acute hearing and a good sense of smell. Sasquatch have been seen eating leaves, berries, roots, birds, fish, rodents, and deer, so their feeding habits are very wide-ranging. They will dig in the ground with their hands, turn over rocks and logs to find grubs and rodents, and pluck vegetation, but they have never been seen using tools or storing food, although they are known to stalk and eat larger animals such as deer. How they kill is unclear, because neither their teeth nor their hands seem to be well suited to the purpose. Perhaps they use rocks as clubs. The massive bodies and powerful jaw muscles of the Sasquatch could be explained by the fact that their diet is largely vegetarian. Plant food is more difficult to chew and digest than meat, so their huge body capacity is perhaps designed to accommodate the large digestive system that such a diet demands. It has been estimated that an adult Sasquatch would need about 5,000 calories each day to maintain an active lifestyle, so the range of available food sources need to be as wide as possible. The strength of the Sasquatch is considerable. Like other great apes, they have a wide repertoire of displays that include shaking undergrowth, pounding on tree trunks, and throwing rocks. They will also frequently twist saplings, breaking the trunks in a spiral pattern. This may be a way of marking territory, or it might be a method of constructing way markers so that other family members can follow their trail. The social life of Sasquatches is unclear. Most are observed alone, but tracks often show 2 or 3 moving together, and a few witnesses have seen small groups of up to half a dozen apparently living together. Footprints indicate that a female will often have a very young child with her, aged about 4 or so, as well as one that is almost adult. This would indicate that the female breeds every 5 years or so, although the evidence is admittedly thin. The young of the Sasquatch seem to be born in the spring, but again evidence is scant. Their lifespan is unknown, but comparison with other primates would indicate about 35 years. It seems that the Sasquatch originally lived in forests across North America. However, since the onset of dense European settlement, it has retreated significantly, and is now confined to the forested mountains of the northwest of the continent. There might be small populations in other forested areas. Total numbers are open to speculation. Estimates have ranged from 2,000 to 10,000, though many would agree that numbers are falling. The Sasquatch does not seem to migrate, nor does it have defined territories. Instead, it wanders in a nomadic fashion. An individual will stay in an area for a few days and then move on. Sasquatch are seen less often in winter months, which may indicate that they are less active in the very cold weather when less food is about. They may build sleeping nests for temporary use out of branches, moss, ferns, and other gathered soft vegetation. There has been a great deal of speculation about where the Sasquatch might be positioned on the evolutionary tree. This has been prompted by the fact that its upright stance makes it look human, while its ape-like head and habits make it seem closer to an ape. The problem is almost impossible to solve, and until the body can be subjected to DNA testing, it will remain so. However, it is fair to note that recent fossil finds have shown that the human evolutionary tree has been considerably more diverse and complex than was previously thought. It is now certain that our human ancestors achieved upright walking long before the brain began to expand, or the hand became a precision instrument, as in modern humans. There was plenty of space on the human family tree for a creature such as the Sasquatch, but at the same time it would not be out of place on the ape branch of the primate family. What evidence is there? Skeptics, of course, refuse to believe that there is a cryptid ape species in North America. Some are less dismissive of the evidence than the scientists who saw the Patterson film back in 1967. They would argue that if a giant man-ape were plodding about North America, it would have been found by now, thereby sweeping aside all the evidence as worthless and giving it no more thought. In 2006, for instance, John Crane, a zoologist and biologist, was quoted in USA Today as saying, "There is no such thing as Bigfoot. No data other than material that's clearly been fabricated has ever been presented." Not all skeptics are so dismissive nor so willing to ignore the mounting evidence. Some are prepared to look at the material that researchers have amassed, even though they find it lacking in credibility. The fact that even those who accept the Sasquatch cannot always agree on the importance of particular pieces of evidence does not help win over skeptics. In 2000, for instance, tracks were found in Oregon's Blue Mountains. Grover Krantz declared them to be genuine and said they constituted important new proof of the reality of Sasquatch. On the other hand, the equally experienced researcher René de Hinden, who firmly believes in the Sasquatch, took one look and said, "Any village idiot can see they are fake." The most prolific and best recorded examples of evidence from the Sasquatch are footprint casts. The huge tracks that they are taken from are physical proof that something was moving around, but the problem that needs to be solved is what made the tracks. Undoubtedly, some tracks are hoaxes made by humans. This has tended to reduce the credibility of the tracks that appear to be genuine, although skeptics would argue that they too are fakes. It is simply the case that nobody has yet worked out how they were made. The few films and photographs that do exist are, with the exception of the Patterson film, so blurred or of such poor quality that it is impossible to rule out such trickery. Even the Patterson film has been denounced as a fake. Some claim to be able to see a zipper in one or two frames, though it is by no means clear that this is the case. There are also problems relating to the speed at which the film is shot, but these might yet be resolved. However, the movie footage is so clear that it must be either a real Sasquatch or a man in a suit. Just because nobody has yet proved how it was faked does not mean that it has to be genuine. That is, of course, to ignore the background evidence, such as the tracks followed by Titmus, but skeptics might suggest that Titmus was either in on the prank or willing to support Patterson for his own reasons. Problems with the evidence. One problem with the sound recordings, hair samples and droppings that have been collected is that the best that can be said about them is that they cannot positively be identified as coming from any known animal. That does not necessarily mean that they come from an unknown animal, only that the diagnostic tests do not produce a clear result. This might be down to something as simple as the contamination of a bare hair sample by sweat from the hand of the person who collected it. In the final analysis, the evidence collected to date points strongly to the fact that there is a real upright walking ape living wild in North America, while the evidence does not prove that this is the case. Skeptics are quite right to point out that it is inherently unlikely that thousands of 7-foot-tall apes are roaming about, but that nobody has yet been able to catch or kill one. The forested mountains of the northwestern areas of North America might be remote, but they are not that remote. Gorillas have been proved to exist in jungle areas every bit as remote as the suggested home range of the Sasquatch, so why is getting absolute proof of the Sasquatch proving to be so difficult? It would be thought that one day a Sasquatch would be found either dead or alive. Every year that slips by without such proof being found, the skeptics argue, is in itself proof that no such animal exists. On the other hand, Sasquatch might well be a real species, perhaps more than one. If that is the case, then humanity will have been guilty of a horrific ecological crime by not protecting its home range, and not providing it with the means it needs to survive. And that would be the end of the chapter, but that's not the end of the book. Next time, we're off to Asia. I'll see you then.